Welcome everyone to Daf Yomi 1 week at a time. This is Masechet Sanhedrin, and today is our third lesson. We are going to be reviewing Daf 16 through 22. So we are in the middle of going through the first Mishnah, which told us who's getting judged by how many judges. So Daf 16 begins or continues our discussion from last time, which was who is going to be judged by 71, by the Sanhedrin, which is 71 judges. So one option we said last week was if an entire tribe or the majority of a tribe does something wrong, so then they go to the Sanhedrin, to the assembly of 71. Another option is that it's the Nasi. The Nasi was the leader after there was no monarchy anymore. The Nasi is what we would call, I guess, the president or the leader of the Jewish nation at the time. So if he does something wrong, he goes to the 71, to the Sanhedrin. Or maybe it's when two tribes are arguing about their inheritance, their nachala, the land that they're going to get. So then you need 70, the Sanhedrin of 71. The Gemara says, no, maybe we are talking about when the whole tribe does idolatry. And even though they're killed as individuals, meaning they're punished as individuals, they are judged as a tribe with the Sanhedrin. Who else is judged by the Sanhedrin? A false prophet is brought before the Sanhedrin. Also, the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, is judged by 71. This is all based on verses in the Torah. Let's say the ox of the Kohen Gadol, of the high priest, killed someone. So we said that the Kohen Gadol, if he does something wrong, he is judged by the Sanhedrin. Now, this is his property. So one opinion is he has to go to the Sanhedrin. The other opinion is, no, this is a regular case of 23 judges instead, right? Meaning, and if it was like a regular issue of money, right? A monetary case that involved the Kohen Gadol, you only need 3 judges, meaning we go according to who or what is the issue, and that's how we decide which judge, that's how we decide which court we are going to go to. Okay, if the king wants to go out to wage war, but it is what we call a milchemet reshut, as opposed to a milchemet mitzvah. Milchemet mitzvah means it's a mitzvah, it is a commandment to go and wage war. A milchemet reshut means it's optional. You could go out to war. If the king wants to do this, he needs to go to the Sanhedrin to ask for permission to go out to war. And from here, the Gemara talks about King David HaMelech, who had a harp over his bed, if you remember. First of all, I should have said this in the beginning, but it is actually almost exactly 5 years since we began learning together. We started January 5th, or at least we started learning January 5th, 2020. So first of all, kol hakavod to everyone who has been learning together since 2020. So it's actually our 5-year anniversary. But if you remember, probably about 5 years ago, give or take a few days, we learned in the beginning of Masechet Brachot that King David had a harp over his bed, and it was basically his alarm clock. right? When the wind blew at midnight, he would wake up, and that's when he would start to learn Torah or to say Tehillim, or to pray to God. But here, the Gemara says that at night he would learn Torah, but during the day he would be awake already, and the wise people would come to discuss the issues of the nation. And David told them that they should go out to war in order to boost the economy. And here the Gemara talks about how did they go out to war. So they asked Achitophel for advice if they will be successful, and then they would ask the Sanhedrin and the Kohen, right, and the priest, to see if they would be successful. So we see from here that the king needs to go to the Sanhedrin to ask permission to go out to war. Another thing that we need to do to ask the Sanhedrin is to expand Jerusalem. If they wanted to expand the walls, they had to ask the Sanhedrin. Again, this is based on a verse speaking about expanding the Mishkan, the tabernacle that was in the desert. Since we're talking about the Mishkan, so the Gemara tells us that Moshe anointed all of the utensils in the Mishkan, and any other utensils that would later in the future be added, you could just use them and they would become sanctified by using them. Next, another responsibility of the Sanhedrin of 71 is that they would go to different cities and set up what we called the small Sanhedrin, which were courts of 23 people. Just like Moshe used to do this, so too the Sanhedrin would do this. And this is based on the Pasuk, right? The Torah says, Shoftim v'shotrim, right? You have to appoint for yourselves judges and policemen. And there needs to be judges and policemen for every tribe and in each city. We'll discuss which city that is. Another thing that is judged by the big Sanhedrin is what's called Ir Nidachat. Ir Nidachat is when the majority of a Jewish city worships idolatry. They are brought to the Sanhedrin, and if they are found guilty, they are actually killed, and the city is destroyed. Because of this, the Gemara teaches that if this city is on the border, you are not allowed to destroy it, because we know that it is very important to maintain a presence on the border, and we don't want to destroy a city that is on the border. Also, we're not allowed to make more than 1 or 2 Ir Nidachat. 3 is already too much. However, you can make 1 in one region, in Yehuda, in Judea, and 1 in the Galil, in the Galilee, but you can't make 2 in each. Okay, how do we know that the Sanhedrin had 71 members, right? Moshe was in charge of the 70 elders in the desert, so 70 plus Moshe equals 71. Daf 17 tells us, no, maybe Moshe isn't counted, and therefore we just need 70 and not 71. So since we're talking about the 70 elders, the Gemara brings up the story of how the 70 elders became the 70 elders. It says that there were 2 people left in the camp, and they got prophecy. So what happened? When they were appointing the 70 elders in the desert, Moshe wasn't sure, like, how do you get 70? Again, we have 12 tribes. So what he did was he chose 6 elders from each tribe. That's 72. And then he put 70 pieces of paper in a box that said on it Zaken, which means elder, and 2 were blanked. And basically, he had everybody draw lots. And therefore, there were 2 lots left in the box because Eldad and Medad, those were the 2 elders, they didn't draw the lots because they were afraid to be rejected. And what's another time that Moshe used lots? When the Leviim, the Levites, took over for the firstborns in order to be the ones that serve God. If you remember, when they were in Egypt, the understanding was that the firstborn of every household would go to the temple, which didn't exist yet, but the idea was that the firstborns were going to be the ones who served in the temple. After the sin of the golden calf, Chet HaEgel, God punishes the nation and says that instead of the firstborn from every household, the Leviim are going to be those that serve in the temple. And therefore, what needed to happen? There needed to be a redeeming, or basically, right, each firstborn needed to be switched by a Levi. However, there were more firstborns than Leviim. So, what did they do? Moshe took 22,000 lots, right, pieces of paper, and wrote on it Ben Levi, and these were the Levites that were going to come in, instead of the firstborns, and then 273, the number of outnumbered the Leviim. Those if they drew a lot that said on it shekel, or 5 shekel, basically, they needed to pay 5 shekel in order to be redeemed. And from this, we get the concept of what's called pidyon, zachar, which is when a family has a newborn boy, they do a ceremony called a pidyon haben, where they get 5 coins and they give it in a ceremony to the local Kohen. And this is symbolic of what happened in the desert as well. Okay, well, let's go back to Eldad and Medad. They stayed in the camp because they felt it wasn't fitting for their greatness, and therefore, right, but they knew that they were great, and God knew that they were great, so God actually gave them prophecy that didn't stop, as opposed to this other 70 elders got prophecy, but it stopped, and they prophesied, right, because they were so humble and they didn't go up, and they stayed in the camp. What was their prophecy? One opinion is that Moshe was going to die and Yoshua was going to take over, or that the Slav, the quail, were going to come, or they prophesied of what's called the War of Gog uMagog, which is right, the war at the end of days. The other elders actually stopped getting prophecy. Now, Yoshua didn't want to hear that Moshe was going to die. And that's why he gets upset, right? Yoshua is the one who tells Moshe, oh my gosh, I can't believe there are these 2 elders in the camp who are getting prophecy. So it could be that this is a proof of what they were prophesying, because it was getting Yoshua upset to hear that Moshe was going to die. Or maybe it was about the other things, and Moshe was happy about the prophecy, or Moshe didn't know about the content of the prophecy at all. Okay, if you remember, we said that there's a court of 23. So now the Gemara says, why do we have a court of 23? Remember, we have the word Eidah. Eidah means 10 men, 10 people. 10, right? 10 plus 10 is 20. Now we know that we need a majority of 2. Right, we don't. This is capital case. You can't just have a majority of 1. So having a majority of 2 would make it 22, and we can't have an even court, and therefore we get to 23. Okay, if all 23 judges say that the person is guilty, then actually, and this is fascinating, the person is acquitted because we say something is wrong here if nobody could see something good in this person. Again, we want to be able to find some sort of merit, and because nobody can find merit, we throw out the judges, and we say that it is invalid. Now, let's go back to the Sanhedrin. The judges of the Sanhedrin need to be imposing. So the Gemara tells us they need to be imposing in a physical way. They need to be tall. They need to be wise. They need to be older. They have to understand witchcraft because that was something that they were going to judge. And they needed to understand 70 languages. And this was because they wanted to make sure that the judges didn't need a translator. As we know, things get lost in translation. And therefore, we wanted to make sure that the judges understood any language that could come to their court. Okay, and therefore, a city that had 2 people who spoke 70 languages and 1 who understands can have a Sanhedrin there. The Gemara explains that it goes through on Daf 17 that when there's certain anonymous references to sages throughout the Talmud, the Gemara says every time it uses this word, it must be this sage, and it has a whole list of these anonymous references in the Talmud. Okay, we said that the number of people in a city to house a Sanhedrin needs to be 120. Why? Again, we're talking about the small Sanhedrin, which is 23. It needs to have at least 120 people. Why? Because we have 23 people for the 23 judges, plus 3 rows of 23 people as backups, right? We're concerned that maybe someone will be invalid, so we have to make sure that there are backups. So 3 rows of 23 people, that gives us 92, plus 10 people who are always in the shul. That's called batlanim. That shows that the city is very important. So that's 102, plus 2 scribes, plus 2 elders who are going to be the court officers, plus 2 litigants, 2 witnesses, 2 witnesses that can discredit the other 2 witnesses, and we have 2 of those, and that gets us to 114. Plus, there needs to be 6 more residents. The Gemara teaches that there are certain professions that need to be in every city, right? A doctor, a butcher, all different things. And that gets us to 120 people. Or maybe you need 230 people, right? Because 23 judges, 1 judge for every 10 people in the city, therefore 230. Another opinion is 277, right? 230 people plus 47 to add if we need. And with that, we finish our first chapter of Masechet Sanhedrin. Okay, let's learn the second chapter. On Daf 18, the Mishnah tells us that the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, can be a judge and can be judged, meaning he can be brought to court. So too, he can be a witness and he can be testified against. He can do chalitza. If you remember, chalitza was if his brother died, his brother was married and died without any children. He cannot do yibum. We'll explain why in a minute. Well, here the Mishnah explains. He can't do yibum because we know that the Kohen Gadol is not allowed to marry a widow. Therefore, he does the chalitza ceremony, which exempts him from doing yibum. Sorry, 1 second. Okay. If an immediate relative of his dies, he cannot become impure. He can follow the funeral procession, but the Gemara is going to explain how he can do that. Or maybe he's not allowed to leave the Beit HaMikdash complex. Okay, a king cannot be a judge and cannot be judged, and he cannot be a witness or be testified against. He cannot do chalitza or yibum, or maybe he can. No one is allowed to marry the king's widow, or maybe a different king, the next king, can marry the king's widow. As we see that David marries Shaul's widow. Okay, now the Gemara is going to discuss all of these things. Okay, if the Kohen Gadol killed someone on purpose, he gets killed. He's considered a regular person, and he gets whatever punishment a regular person would get. If he kills someone by accident, he goes to the Ir Miklat, to the city of refuge. Now, you might think that he doesn't go. Why? Because the only way that a person who goes to the Ir Miklat can get out is if the Kohen Gadol dies. Now, if the Kohen Gadol goes into the Ir Miklat, one would think, right? So that basically means he could never get out, because the only way to get out is if he dies, right? So you might think that because he can never get out, he doesn't go. The Gemara says, no, he goes and he never gets out. If he transgresses a positive or a negative mitzvah, he's judged by 3 people like everybody else, not by 71. Okay, and the Gemara says, wait a minute, let's discuss, right, we see that maybe a Kohen Gadol should not be a witness because it's not good for his honor. So the Gemara says, you're right, he can give testimony in front of the king, or, right, at the Sanhedrin. But the king is not allowed to be on the Sanhedrin, and the king and the Kohen Gadol can't be part of judges who extend the year, right? Why? Because they have biases. Why? Right? Because first of all, no one's going to want to argue with the king or with the Kohen Gadol, right? The Kohen Gadol doesn't want it to be cold on Yom Kippur, right? So he's not going to want to extend the year. The king does want to extend the year because of wages and things like that. So they are not allowed to sit in judgment about the leap year. And then the Gemara talks about when you do a leap year, we rely on calculations, but also we look at nature to see what is going on. We said that the Kohen Gadol cannot do yibum ever, whether his brother was married or he was only betrothed, meaning from Erusin, even though let's say they never had relations. So why is that a problem? So the Gemara says, you're right, at the top of Daf 19, the first time they would have relations, it would be okay because she is still a virgin, and she's a widow, but they were never together. But afterwards, he can't stay married to her because she is really a widow, and therefore he is not allowed to do yibum, and he can only do chalitza. We said that if someone close to the Kohen Gadol dies, he can't go out with the funeral procession, but he can go after them, meaning once they like basically turn the corner, right? So he can go after them, and then he hides, and then they come out, and then they hide, and he comes out. The idea is that we don't want him to become impure. Another opinion is that he's not allowed to leave the Beit HaMikdash. The Gemara says, how is that possible? He needs to go home. We know that he, has a wife. He has a family. How is this possible? So one opinion is, no, really, he can't leave. Another opinion is he can't leave his state of holiness, but he is actually allowed to leave the Beit HaMikdash. When he comforts others, the Gemara describes how they stand. The deputy and the person who used to be the Kohen Gadol stand on his right, and the head of the court and the mourners and the nation stand on his left. And then he can go and comfort everyone. When he is being comforted, so then the Kohen who used to be the Kohen Gadol doesn't come because we don't want him to feel bad. Now, if any of you have been to a Jewish funeral, at the end of the burial, all the people line up in two lines, and the mourners walk by, and everyone comforts them. So here the Gemara describes how it used to be that the mourners would stand and the nation would walk by, but it actually caused fights of who would go first and who would go after, and therefore they said, you know what? Everyone just stand where you are, make those two lines, and the mourners pass through the people making the lines. And this row needs to have at least 10 men, not including the mourners. And the Kohen Gadol says, Tinachamu, right? You should be comforted when he is comforting people. And it describes how they comfort him and he comforts them. Okay, a king of Israel cannot be judged, but judges cannot be judged, but judges from David's house kings from David's house can be judged, which is Zohar had mentioned Shlomo was a judge. So we're going to see that there's a distinction between the Davidic dynasty and the Israelite dynasty. Right? There was once a slave of King Yanai who killed someone, and the court said that Yanai needs to come to court also, and he needed to stand and not sit because he was before God, and the judges were afraid of him, right? Because he's the king. So basically, Gabriel came and he killed all the judges, and therefore they said, you know what? Kings of Israel cannot be judged. It gets very dangerous, and therefore we should not have this case happen again. We said that kings cannot do chalita or yibum, or maybe they can because they can renounce their own honor. And here we get to the stories of David, right? David could marry the daughters of Shaul, but not his wives. Right, we have Meirav and Michal. They're both Shaul's daughters. Now the Gemara says, wait a minute, those are two sisters, and we know that a man is not allowed to marry two sisters. So the Gemara says, you're right. After Meirav died, then he married Michal. Or really, he married Michal, but not Meirav. He got her because he killed Goliath, but he never actually married her. And he got Michal when he got the 100 foreskins from the Plishtim, and he gave money, and it was like a canceled loan, so it was real kiddushin, it was a real betrothal, or maybe it wasn't, and maybe he never actually really married Michal either. Now the Gemara explains, right, if you look at the Psukim, it says that Shaul gave Michal to Palti, even though she was married to David. And he gave Meirav to Adriel, even though also she was supposed to be married to David. So what happened, right? And Meirav gave birth to children, and Michal raised those children. And the Gemara basically describes them as Michal's children, even though we know, and the Gemara is going to tell us in a minute, Michal never had children, but because she raised Meirav's children, they're seen as her own children. So too with Naomi, we have the same case with Naomi, right? Ruth has a child, and that child is basically given to Naomi to raise, and it's called Naomi's child. Okay. It says that, right, oh, and the Gemara now talks about different people, right? So Yocheved gave birth to Moshe, but the daughter of Paro raised him, therefore he's called her child. Yaakov gave birth to the tribes, but they're also called Yosef's children when he supports them in Egypt, right? In last week's Parsha and this week's Parsha. Aaron had children, but they're called Moshe's children because because they're called Moshe's children because he taught them Torah, right? And it talks about the Gemara tells us that God saved Palti from sinning because he never slept with Michal, meaning Michal was really David's wife, and therefore, even though Shaul gave Michal to Palti, he never slept with her, therefore he never sinned. And since we're drawing parallels, right, Yosef also didn't sleep with the wife of Potiphar, and Boaz didn't sleep with Ruth, even though, right, in the Goren, when she came to in the middle of the night, right, all of these people, were tempted into doing something wrong, and they resisted the temptation. Okay, Daf 20, right? We know the pasuk in Eshet Chayil, Rabot Banot Asu Chayil, Ve'at Alit Al Kulana, right? All of these women did good things. So the Gemara says it's not really talking about, right here, it's talking about Boaz and Yosef who resisted temptation. Ve'at Alit, right? And Palti was even it was the hardest because they were officially married and he still didn't have relations with Michal, right? And then it says Sheker Hachain, which means, right, it's beauty is terrible or whatever, is Sheker is false. So that's talking about Yosef. Hevel Hayofi, right? Beauty is nothing. That's talking about Boaz. Yirat Hashem, Hiti Talal is talking about Palti, who was God fearing. Or maybe it's talking about the generation of Moshe and the generation of Yoshua and then the generation of Chizkiyahu. Okay, next Mishnah. We're talking about kings, so other things about kings. Kings cannot go out to a funeral if their relative dies, like the Kohen Gadol, or they can. It's learned from David that he went out for Avner, or no, that case was different. It was only done to help the people, right? Meaning it showed that he wasn't part of the plot to kill Avner. Right, Avner, well, we'll see. The Gemara is going to explain in a minute. Right, so the Gemara says, how did a funeral procession work? The women would go in front of the deceased, right, and they would cry, and then the king would go after. Or, right, David went in front also, and this was again to appease the nation. Right, originally the nation thought that David would want to kill Avner, but then they came and they comforted David, right? So the Gemara talks about what's going on, right? So Avner is Shaul was Shaul's general, and Shaul made him destroy the city of Nov, right? The city of priests. So the Gemara tells us that Avner should have argued with Shaul about Nov, therefore he was killed. Some say he actually did protest, but Shaul didn't listen to him, and he made David's kingdom wait because he supported Ishbosheth for 2.5 years, and that was his punishment. Okay, a king, when he is mourning, sits on a dargash. This is a type of chair when he is being comforted. The Gemara asks, what is this chair? So they say it's a good luck bed. It's not usually sat on during the year. You do not need to turn it over when a person is mourning, right? In the time of the Mishnah, the Gemara, they would turn over all of the beds when a person is in mourning. This is where we get the custom of sitting on lower chairs when a person is mourning. Okay, the next Mishnah tells us that the king can wage war, a milchemet reshut, right? A optional, or right, he has permission to go out to war. Again, if he gets permission from the Sanhedrin, from 71 judges, and he can break a path through anyone's field, and he can make it as wide as he wants, and he can take any spoils from the war that he wants. And the Gemara is going to explain more. So now the Gemara says the king can basically do anything that's written in Parshat HaMelech. Right, in Parshat HaMelech, this is where when the people ask Shmuel, right, Samuel, for a king, Shmuel says, are you sure you want a king? Look, the king can do terrible things. He can take whoever he wants. He can do whatever he wants. So the question is, when Shmuel said this, was it true, meaning a king can really do whatever he wants? Or was Shmuel trying to scare the nation to say, oh, no, we don't want a king. Never mind, we don't want a king. So that's the machloket here. One opinion is the king can do everything that he said, or no, it was only to scare the people, but a king really can't do it. That's the machloket. The Gemara teaches us that there are 3 mitzvot that the Jewish people needed to do when they entered the land of Israel. They need to appoint a king, they need to destroy Amalek, and they need to build the temple. So it's a machloket if making a king is a mitzvah, it's a commandment, it's something you have to do, or it's something you can do. It's a reshut. You can if you want. People really wanted the king to judge them, but some of the people wanted to have a king so that they could be like the other nations. Okay, which was a problem, right? So now we have these 3 mitzvot. They didn't know what order they should do it. So first you appoint a king, then you go to war with Amalek, and then you build the Beit HaMikdash, right? When David wanted to build the Beit HaMikdash, it was after he destroyed all of Amalek. And since we're talking about building the Beit HaMikdash and kings, the Gemara tells us that Shlomo ruled over the whole world and also the heavens, in the sense that he had control over demons, or and then basically slowly he lost control, right? Then he only had control over the world and not the demons, and in the end he didn't even rule over all of Israel, and then only over Yerushalayim, and then only over his bed, and then only over his staff. And here I'm not sure if we learned the story yet. I think the story is actually in Sanhedrin, so I think we're going to learn it. But there's a story of the king of demons and Shlomo. Did we ever learn that? I don't remember. I think it's in Sanhedrin, actually. So basically, there's a machloket of the end of that story. Basically, the demon takes over and he's dressed up as Shlomo HaMelech. One opinion is Shlomo HaMelech never comes back to be king. Another opinion is he does come back. I'll just say parenthetically, why would we want to say that Shlomo doesn't come back? Because at the end of his life, he does terrible things. And one would say, it wasn't really Shlomo, it was this demon, and that's who was doing all of these terrible things. So that's just one explanation, but that's something else. Okay, we said the spoils of the war. So basically, if the spoils came from another king, so all of those spoils go to the king, but the regular spoils, that gets split, half to the king and half to the nation. Okay, Daf 21, the next Mishnah tells us a king cannot have more than 18 wives, or maybe he can have more as long as they're good and they're not going to serve idols. Or even if he has one wife who is terrible, he has to get rid of her because they are a bad influence on her. Or even if they're good, he cannot have more than 18 wives. The Gemara asks here, it's a very interesting discussion, right? Do we expound the reasons for mitzvot or not, right? Why? Because if we give a reason, right? So if I say you can't eat pork because it's not healthy, if scientists come out now and say pork is the healthiest thing in the world, you're like, oh, I guess I can eat it now because the only reason I couldn't eat it was because it isn't healthy, right? So the question is, do we, right, how much do we listen to the reasons, right? So when it says he can't have more than 18 wives, does it, because they're going to lead him astray? So does it mean that if they're all amazing, maybe he can have 100 wives? Or no, you can't have 18 wives. And we're afraid that they're going to lead him astray. That's basically what the Gemara says, right? We're concerned about the influence that these women are going to have over the king. How do we know 18 wives? It says that David had 18 wives. He had 6 wives in Hebron, and then it says you can add chahena vechahena, which means like those and like those. So 6 and like 6 and like 6 gives us 18. Or maybe it means 24, right? Like you can double it, or 48. But the opinion that we hold is 18. It says that Michal was so beloved to David that she's called an eglah. She's called a calf, not a cow, but she's a calf, right? She's so beautiful, like a calf. But we know that, and here the Gemara says it straight out, that Michal did not have any children. But basically, the verse says that this wife who's called Eglah did have a child. So how can you say that that's Michal? So either she did have a child, but she died in childbirth, right? Meaning she was never alive when she had a child, or she had a child before, but then after she gets in trouble by laughing at David, she gets punished that from then on she would never have children. The Gemara tells us that don't worry if you feel sad for David that he only had 18 wives. Don't worry because he had many more concubines. And he actually had 400 children from Eshet Yifat Tor. Eshet Yifat Tor is the woman who is not Jewish, who's taken captive from war, but you have to wait a month and then you can marry her, but because she's not Jewish, she's not considered really a wife. And the Gemara tells us that Tamar, who's David's daughter, was actually the daughter of an Eshet Yifat Tor, of one of these women who was taken captive. And how do we know that? Because Tamar says, if you remember the terrible story with her brother Amnon, which we're going to talk about in 1 second, but Tamar says, don't worry, I'll ask David if we can get married. How can they get married if they're siblings? The Gemara says they weren't really siblings because her mother wasn't Jewish, which would then make her not Jewish, but that's another complication. But now the Gemara describes the terrible story of Amnon and Tamar. The story is that Amnon is obsessed with Tamar, and he gets this plan to basically seduce her, and then he rapes her, and then it says that he hates her. The Gemara says, why does he hate her after he was so obsessed with her beforehand? And the Gemara says that basically when they had relations, he actually one of her pubic hairs gets caught on his member, and he basically gets castrated, and therefore he hates Tamar. And after this episode with Tamar, the rabbis decreed that you cannot be secluded, meaning a man cannot be secluded with a married woman, and he cannot have relations with a virgin, meaning someone who's single. And then the Gemara says even more than that, right? This is the idea of yichud. If you've heard of yichud means where a man and a woman who are not married are not allowed to be alone together. The Gemara says, wait a minute, this is a biblical mitzvah that a man is not allowed to be alone with a woman. So the Gemara says, you're right. A man is not allowed to be secluded, is not allowed to be alone with someone who he's forbidden to. And then the rabbis decreed after Amnon v'Tamar that even a single man and a single woman should not be in a secluded area alone, because again, I think very brilliantly, the rabbis were saying, if you're secluded, it can lead to problems and dangerous things, and therefore you have to protect. We have to protect the women, and therefore they should not be alone with men. Okay, next Mishnah. A king is not allowed to have a lot of horses, only enough to pull his chariot, and he's also not allowed to have a lot of money, only enough to pay the wages of his soldiers. And he has to write his own Torah, and he has to take it with him wherever he goes. Okay, then the Gemara explains he can't have a lot of horses, but he can have, if the horses are needed for chariots, so that's okay. He just can't have horses that are just kind of hanging around for no reason. A king is not allowed to have too much gold and silver for himself, but he can have money if he needs it for the national finances, to pay the wages and things like that. Shlomo did actually have a lot of horses, and he had many stables. He was very wealthy, but he lost some of that wealth after he married the daughter of Paro from Egypt. And that's where, and the Gemara describes on the day that Shlomo married Bat Paro, the princess of Egypt, was the day that God made Rome, founded Rome. So basically, it's the beginning of the end, as we say, which is very fitting because on Friday we have the fast of Asara B'Tevet, of the 10th of Tevet, which also commemorates the beginning of the end, It commemorates, we're mourning the siege around Jerusalem, which led ultimately, just 2.5 years later, to the destruction of the temple. So here we see that things might seem very small, but they lead to the ultimate destruction. Okay, hold on one second. So the Gemara says that the king always has to have this Torah with him wherever he goes, and it needs to be written for him. Even if he gets one from his father, he needs to write his own. And since we're talking about Torah scrolls, the Gemara tells us that the Torah was given in Ktav Ivri. Ktav Ivri is what we call ancient Hebrew. It's a different Hebrew script, and it was given in Hebrew language. Later on in the time of Ezra, it was given in Ktav Ashuri. Ktav Ashuri is our modern Hebrew letters, and it was given in Aramaic so that everybody could understand it. And ultimately, the Jews chose to perpetuate the Torah in Ktav Ashurit, which is the way our Torah is written, but in Hebrew and not in Aramaic. Ezra tells us, the Torah tells us that, the Gemara tells us that the Torah could have been given to Ezra. He was so great, but Moshe was greater. Okay, last daf 22. The Torah was always, as we said, or the Gemara now says, no, the Torah was always written in Ashurit, but then it was forgotten, and then it was reminded again. The Gemara talks about Daniel. Daniel actually lived in Bavel, in Babylonia, and he was the only one who could read the writing, literally the writing on the wall. That's where it comes from, because it was in Ktav Ashurit, and nobody could understand it. It was in this certain code. The Gemara talks about what if you like codes, you could look at the top of Daf 22. It talks about different codes, what's called Atbash, which is like Aleph and Taf, and Bet and Shin, meaning you switch the letters based on other parallel letters. Okay, last Mishnah for today. The regular people are not allowed to ride the king's horse, or to sit in his chair, or to use his scepter. They're not allowed to see him get a haircut, or get dressed, or use the bathhouse, and because they always need to be in awe of the king. So the Gemara explains that it talks about the end of David's life. If you remember, Avishag is brought to David, and she is basically used to warm up David. And she's not a wife. They don't have relations. They don't get married. And therefore, Shlomo could have married her, but not Adoniah. She was just there to warm David up. David couldn't marry her because he already had 18 wives. You might think that he could have divorced the wives, but we know that divorce is frowned upon when you don't need to. So he didn't divorce his wife, and therefore he never married Avishag. From here, the Gemara talks about pairing off couples, right? What's called a zivug, right? A zivug from zug, from two, right? So the Gemara tells us that making a couple is as hard as splitting the Red Sea. The Gemara says, really? But we know that it says 40 days before a child is born, is formed, a heavenly voice comes out and says, this person is going to go to this person. That doesn't sound so hard. Rather, the first one is like the first pair, I guess what we might call your soulmate, is decreed when 40 days before the baby is formed. But the second, soulmate is very hard to create, like Yam Suf. And then the Gemara talks about this first love, right? The first love is or your first wife is always going to be the best. Yes. Okay. Last thing, the king is supposed to get a haircut every day. The Kohen Gadol is supposed to get a haircut once a week. A regular Kohen gets a haircut once a month. This is all based on verses. And from here, the Gemara talks about Kohanim not being allowed to drink wine when they're on duty. And there's a machluket if a Kohen nowadays can drink, because maybe the Beit HaMikdash will be built today, and maybe he's going to be on duty, and therefore maybe he's not allowed to drink wine. But we say, no, that's not the case. So too with cutting their hair, right? Maybe a Kohen should always have his haircut, and the Gemara says, no, he can always just get a haircut. But a Kohen is not allowed to do temple service if he's drunk or if he has long hair. And the last thing that the Gemara teaches is that the Kohanim used to have this special, beautiful haircut, which was very expensive. And some people tried to emulate the Kohen Gadol by getting this very expensive haircut. And with that, we finish the second chapter of Sanhedrin. Be'ezrat Hashem, we will pick it up next week when we continue at our regular time and day. So we have 3 minutes. If anybody has any questions or comments, yes.
Please tell me I'm wrong. You did not implicate Melech David in another murder, did you? Did you say something that he was?
The people thought that maybe David would have wanted to kill Avner, and because of that, David came out and grieved for Avner to show that he was not involved. They thought, again, right, meaning David takes over from Shaul. So you might think, right, when the new king comes, he kills everybody from the old king, and David says, no, I loved Shaul and I loved David, I loved Avner, and I did not have anything to do with their death.
It was more than I was going to be able to handle with Uriah and all that stuff, and we still keep waiting for the Moshiach to come through his line.
It's true.
Okay.
We're good. We're good.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other comments?
Yes.
Questions?
I wanted to say about the Atbash. On the day of the week, I'm trying to remember. I had it. It was very cool. The day of the week is for Rosh Hashanah, which is Aleph, and it's also Taf. I'm trying to remember the different holidays come out on the same day of the week, and then it when you come to the end and you say Aleph, Bet, whatever, and when you come to the end, then you come to Yom Ha'atzmaut. It's really cool. It's really cool. I just don't remember.
Yeah, there's something that, meaning there's certain holidays that if one holiday is on, let's say, a Tuesday, the corresponding holiday is also on a Tuesday.
Right, in that same year. In that same year. And the only one that's a little off is Purim, but you have to look at the year before. So, but then it does work. So,
yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Excellent. Okay. Well,
you said that there's a fast this coming Friday, but just because of our time, is it still Friday for us?
Yes. Yes. It's the 10th of Tevet.
Yeah, I remember.
It's the same. Yes, all over. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. So when you have Tevet, that's when you have the fast. It's not on our time zone. It's when your own time zone.
Yes, Mommy, you wanted to ask a question?
You're on mute.
We can't hear you. You're muted. Wait, still can't hear you. How come we can't hear you? No. Maybe unplug the earphones.
Did.
Now. Yeah.
Okay. Daniel was teaching Bereshit, and we got to Paro, and Moshe, approached Paro when Paro would go to the Nile. And the reason was because Paro did his needs in the Nile.
Yes.
That supposedly you can explain better.
Yes, meaning Paro, right, the Pharaoh never showed the people that he had to go to the bathroom or to bathe so that they would think that he was a god, right? It's the same idea, right? That if they're not seen as human beings they're not seen as having human needs. Yes. Therefore, they have to do it in very private.
Yes. So Moshe approached him and he was most vulnerable.
Exactly. Excellent. Okay, but that was a spoiler for next week's Parsha, or 2 weeks.
It doesn't hurt to hear things twice.
Of course.
Well, we also have Yiftach, that he came to the king, the king was sitting on Ehud, sorry. Yeah.
Yes.
He was left-handed, whatever, and that's why they didn't check him. That he had a sword.
And he goes to the bathroom. He sees him in the bathroom.
Ba'aliyah, whatever they called it. He
Yeah.
was in the bathroom, and then when he says, I have something to tell you, a message to tell you from God. So he stood up, and then he killed him with the
Exactly.
sword.
Exactly.
And then
Exactly.
he locked the door behind him, and the guards thought he was busy, so they
Yes.
didn't open the door until it got very late, and by that time, Ehud was gone already.
Yeah.
Ehud, I'm sure it's Ehud and not
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
I get the names all
Yiftach
confused,
is
but
the one who with the daughter.
with the daughter that he gave
Yeah.
an oath, then
Yes. Yeah.
yeah.
All right. Wishing everyone a Shavua Tov, a Shabbat Shalom, Tzom
Thank
Kal, all of those things.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye, guys.